How's it going, everyone? Welcome to week 3 of the Chamber Music Society of Salt Lake City score breakdown. Today we're going to be focusing on the third movement of the Fauré piano quartet in C minor. Now at this point we've done a little bit of work on sonata form, we've done a little bit of work on metric relationships from instrument to instrument. However, today I want to talk a little bit about narrative when it comes to composition, when it comes to classical music in general. Something to know about this third movement, which happens to be the slow movement of the piece, is that it was written after Fauré broke up with his fiancée at the time. And as a result, some scholars view this movement as a letter to love lost. However, like anything in classical music, there is another faction that completely disagrees.
The composer's friend and biographer, Émile Vuillermoz, I think that's how you say his name, protested against such an interpretation. He wrote, "Nothing, in my opinion, warrants docile acceptance of such a sentimental and imprudent thesis." Fauré's reserve always prevented him from following the example of romantic artists who allowed the whole world to witness their personal frustrations. Capable of enlarging his style to treat a pathetic theme possessing something universal, Fauré would never have consented to express himself in such a spectacular manner.
Now, I personally disagree with this statement because when it comes down to it, composers, like anyone else, are human beings. Now, I, and you, and everyone watching this, has had a relationship that has ended in some sort of breakup. And especially if it's a bad breakup, it's a little bit ridiculous to assume that a difficult emotional experience like that won't affect the rest of your life, won't affect your artistic output. Now, one could make the argument that Fauré didn't want this particular movement to be perceived as a letter to a love lost, because he didn't think that was classy and that's just not how he rolled. But to say that this particular movement was not informed by the experience whatsoever, I think is a little bit of a ridiculous assertion unless you view composers as if they're robots. So today, we're going to listen to this movement as if it is a letter to a love that was lost, as if it was a letter to someone that he deeply cared about. I think that's a lens that all of us can relate to, and as a result, I think it's a lens that will be useful when pulling this movement apart. In this movement, there are 3 major sections, very similar to what we heard in the second movement: an A section, a B section, and a return to an A section. At the beginning of this first A section, we find ourselves in C minor, moving to D minor. The music returns back to C. D flat major. However, in measure 5, we're back to C minor. A flat minor, moving into a C dominant chord in the 8th measure. To me, this sounds like a composer who has something on his mind where consciously he's trying to direct his mind in another direction, but his subconscious keeps bringing him back to the same chord, the same thought. Is this an instance of Fauré trying to direct his mind from the painful memories that he shared with his ex-fiancée, but being pulled back over and over and over again, regardless of his best efforts to get away from those thoughts? Now, Fauré plays around in C minor for a number of measures until we get to material that kind of comes out of the blue as a result of a modulation that's only prepared by 2 chords: B flat minor, E flat major, resolving to A flat major. Now, this A flat major section to me sounds like an exploration or even a remembrance of all of the memories of contentedness that he felt with this woman. Take a listen to this section for a moment and compare it to what we heard at the beginning of the piece. I think you'll know what I mean. However, Fauré doesn't remain in this character in a way that seems stagnant. We get to a really interesting B major harmony, where all of a sudden it sounds like we're reaching for something, reaching for some sort of higher ideal. But then the rug is lightly pulled out from under us. We release into this beautiful E-flat major harmony. Now, Fauré remains in this harmonic world for the next couple of bars, and I think that's because there's more for the listener to get out of this harmonic material. He could have just gone through these set of chords and moved on to something else, but thematically, I think it makes sense to dwell here for a little bit to really give the listener a strong sense of centeredness. But then we move into something that sounds almost like Wagnerian chromaticism in the harmony. That takes us for an entirely different journey and trip than we've heard at any point in this movement, as well as any point in the piece thus far. And interestingly enough, this section starts off in C major, the parallel major of the original key. Now, the sound of C minor compared to C major are two vastly different sound worlds. What these two key signatures evoke for the listener are two very different emotional experiences, and I don't think it's an accident that Fauré chose to start this section, the most searching, the most unstable, the most longing section of the movement, in a key that is so far away from where we started at the start of the A section. Take a listen to this, and once again, as you listen, come up with some adjectives that you would use to describe the emotions Fauré is trying to communicate in this section. Now, at this point, we have returned back to the A section. However, Fauré doesn't give us the same material that we heard at the beginning of the movement and simply copy and paste it. Here he gives us a different element that we haven't heard until this point in the movement. He gives us running 30-second notes in the piano, which creates this ethereal, dream-like sound world that allows the music on top of it, in the cello, in the viola, and in the violin, to take on a completely different character than what we heard at the beginning, even though, more or less, the writing in the strings is identical to what we saw at the beginning of the movement, until the coda that is based in this warm, luscious chorale in the strings and a heart-breaking melody in the right hand of the piano. Here, Fauré moves us to D major, into B diminished, C major again, as if he's reaching to an antithesis to the C minor feeling of the movement. Then into C dominant 7, F major, until out of fatigue and out of the realization that fighting the inevitable is a useless pursuit, we fall into the arms of C minor once more. What the end of this movement sounds like to me is this. It sounds like a man who is brokenhearted and would do anything to get his mind onto something else, but simply can't bring himself to, not just because of the amount of pain that he's in, but because of a refusal to forget and to erase the wonderful and loving memories that he shared with someone who, at the time, he thought was the love of his life. And as he goes through the movement to the end of it, he almost realizes that trying to forget the positive, the negative, is a futile pursuit. And when we reach that final C minor chord, that C minor harmony, at the end, It's almost as if Fauré gives up, though not in a nihilistic way, but perhaps a broken-hearted acceptance. Once again, I'm sure there are a lot of music historians that would come after that particular synopsis and totally rip it to shreds. However, as a string player, when I sit down to pull apart a piece of chamber music, bringing some sort of narrative to the table is not just useful for me as an individual instrumentalist, but it's useful in the sense that I am trying to share my musical interpretation with my colleagues in the group. Because the mechanics in a music theory for a movement like this is interesting, but it doesn't actually allow for me to communicate an emotional narrative that I might be feeling through, let's say, the A section, that I then need to communicate to my colleagues in order to get a unified vision for the movement in general, in order to put on the best performance that we possibly can. Because again, contrary to popular belief, classical musicians, composers, instrumentalists, we're not robots, we're human. Narrative structure is the way that we are best able to communicate our thoughts and feelings to the world. And narrative structure doesn't come from music theory, it comes from emotion. So that's it for today's video. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe to the channel. It helps out our channel immensely in the YouTube algorithm. Next week, we are going to be jumping into the fourth and final movement of the Fauré Piano Quartet in C minor. If you want to get a head start on that, I have included a couple of fabulous recordings down in the description below. Take a listen to those to familiarize yourself with what it is that we're going to be talking about next week at Wednesday, 12 p.m. Mountain Standard. Until then, enjoy your week, and we will see you then.